Hello and welcome to Give and Toke, the show that elevates the conversation about cannabis to a higher level. I'm your host Paul O'Donoghue, and today we welcome Sean Maloney, who is the sole legal counsel and commercial manager for MediCann Health. With a Bachelor of Economics and a Bachelor of Laws from the University of Western Australia, Sean has worked as a Senior Consultant and Solicitor at a Big Four firm, along with holding senior advisory and compliance roles at the Australian Securities Exchange. MediCann is an Australian-based medicinal cannabis company focused on improving the quality of life of people in need through the use of affordable, reliable, and science-backed medicinal cannabis products. In this episode, we'll pick Sean's brain to better understand the legal framework around medicinal cannabis in Australia. We'll have some fun with the quiz where we will talk about The Simpsons' incompetent lawyer Lionel Hutz. We'll talk about his work at the ASX and a whole bunch more. It was a fantastic conversation with Sean, and if you do enjoy this episode, please make sure that you like and follow on your podcast platform of choice. And if you listen on Apple and Spotify, be sure to give us a 5-star rating, because those ratings help us reach more people, particularly in a space that is as highly regulated and censored as cannabis. If you want to stay in touch, check us out at Give and Toke on Instagram. You can email us via giveandtoke@gmail.com, and you can go to giveandtoke.com.au to check out our amazing range of merchandise and accessories. But for now, please enjoy my conversation with Sean Maloney. Sean Maloney, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here, Paul.
Now, you and I met at what I like to call Cannabis School Camp, the United in Compassion conference that we were just up at in Brisbane. How was your UIC, and what did you get out of the weekend there?
It was awesomely fun, I would say. I've been to a fair few conferences over my earlier professional career, outside like mining conferences and other biotech ones, and sometimes they're a little stuffy. But this one was really fun, full of fantastic people, very like-minded people. Also, just the opportunity to put a face to the name of all these people that you have phone convos with, you have emails back and forth, and share a beer, chat over the industry, the current issues being faced, and I suppose also the other part, the compliance day talks were great. All of the other lawyers and compliance professionals, it was a good opportunity for us to come together and kind of have a chin wag about the various issues that we're facing. And, it was great to hear that others, experience the same difficulties of us. And we sort of, could formulate a bit of a plan. Here's what we should be doing. Here's what we should be thinking about. So yeah, I would say awesome conference. Really enjoyed it.
It's a rather fraught industry, like obviously there's so much uncharted territory already in the space, but if you look at it and dig deeper in a legal sense, there's so little precedent, there's so little kind of ideas to go off of. Do you find that daunting or exciting that this industry has so much uncharted territory?
Definitely a little bit of both, I'd say. So one of the aspects that really drew me to the industry is the fact that it's all new law, right? And it's all open for younger lawyers, midway through their career to kind of take a hold of this area and make it their own, and I guess create a lot of the guidance and help to shape some of the jurisprudence. But on the other side, trying to advise clients in this space when there's 0 court cases that have actually gone to trial yet, obviously a couple pending, but very little court cases to go on. And us lawyers, we very much like to have years and years of court cases to analyze so that we can make our best call. But often what it ends up being is, when we place our best guess on the interpretation of the law, and we're really trying to guess what the regulator is going to interpret as their view on what the law is. And so it's a little bit of guesswork, but I think that one of the aspects of the industry that really helps is the collaborative nature. All of the other lawyers, the other colleagues in the industry, we have regular chats to kind of, use each other as a sounding board and bounce things off and say, hey, this is what I'm thinking. What do you reckon? I know there's no cases, but what's your best guess? So yeah, definitely a bit of both on that. As the answer to that question.
The smartest people in this industry are looking for the ways to work together. I think it's a really unique space in that way that there are opportunities to kind of succeed as individual businesses or individuals whilst lifting everyone else up. So I think that is a really important key to surviving this industry with so little precedent is actually having people to check in with, even, if they're quote unquote competitors. So it's kind of nice to hear that collaboration. And I think that is unique to this industry. I think a lot of people talk about what's challenging about this industry, what's difficult, where things aren't working. But I think the people really make it work. So I'm really pleased to hear that kind of collaborative side of things.
Yeah, it's an interesting industry where I think different to any others, we're all competitors, but we're actually all partners. And if you think about it, and I had a lot of chats with different people at UIC about this, our main competitor is actually the black market. It's not other companies because we're all on the same team.
Let's talk a little bit about you, Sean. You came out of university and into 5 years at PwC, a couple of years at the ASX, and now you're the legal counsel at MediCann. How did you end up in cannabis?
Well, it was a bit of a journey. So I guess I'll take you back to the start. PwC was great, awesome experience. I learned from some of the best people in the area. At the time, the tax law practice was the leading practice around Australia. And so I learned from great people, learned great professional skills, honed my core legal skills, but it wasn't going to be a good fit for me long term. The part of the culture, it'd be pretty common to be working 60 hours a week, getting home at 10 p.m. at night, that sort of thing. So the opportunity of the ASX came up, and I've been just sort of moved from tax law, where I started at PwC, into more commercial corporate law. And ASX was a really good opportunity because it's being, on the ground in the market, acting as a regulator, day-to-day conversations with the various senior management leaders from the companies that you look after as their corporate regulator at the ASX. And a sort of a year in, it was a total 4 years, 4.5 year stint at ASX. I got handed the biotech portfolio, which contained 12 out of the 20 cannabis related companies listed on the exchange. And that kind of sparked my interest into the area. And I also had a personal connection. So a very close friend of mine has Tourette's syndrome, and he grew up throughout high school very much suffering from this syndrome, and then started self-medicating with cannabis, and it was incredible. It completely stopped the fits, all of the symptoms that he was experiencing, and it turned his life around. And so seeing this firsthand, thinking to myself, wow, there's some real benefit here. We've missed something major about, with the benefits that you can get from this plant. And then that happening at the same time as me being involved in regulating these cannabis companies, and, developing an understanding of the framework, which how they need to operate, developing all of their corporate governance, regulatory actions. And I kind of made the decision at that point that I think cannabis law is going to be a huge area. It's only just taken off. There's going to be lawyers who need to be taking a hold of the space and developing the legal practice offerings that are available. And I thought, this is the time to make the jump. And it's at that point that I got in contact with Matt, CEO, and we had some common friends through university. And I sort of said, hey, I'm looking to get into this industry as a lawyer. I know you guys have been doing great work. I'm familiar with the clinic that they run and then the products that are supplied by the company. And I said, have you got a need for a legal counsel? And it just happened to be one of those moments where you get the timing right, and he goes, actually, yes, we're looking for exactly that. And over a couple of months, we kept talking, and then I decided to make the jump over, and kind of it's been a year since then, and I've never looked back.
Right on. And I think that's a great segue to ask, kind of tell us a little bit more about MediCann itself and also specifically your role there.
Well, I'm the sole legal counsel, so I'm responsible for all of the compliance and regulatory responsibilities that the company faces. I'm also their general corporate, so I handle all of their, a lot of their corporate governance, all of their contracts. It's fairly broad. It's not just cannabis work. You do employment law, we're doing trademark work, all sorts of other sort of different areas of the law. So a bit of a generalist. But a small company, I need to wear many hats. So the other role is the commercial manager, where I'm just doing everything that's needed to facilitate moving the product from suppliers to patients. And I suppose where MediCann fits in there is we have a clinic with a lot of patients around Australia. We do face-to-face appointments and we do telehealth appointments. We're based in Osborne Park in Perth. And then we also have products. So we're the sponsor of about 10 or so different products into the Australian market. Those are the kind of the main aspects of the supply chain that we work in. And obviously, we've been growing very quickly, just like the rest of the market. But we've also been enjoying quite a bit of financial success. And it's at one of those points where, you know, we're trying to take it to the next level. There's the very large players in the industry who we all know of, and then there's a handful of mid-sized players who work together but are also kind of jostling it out, and that's where we sit at the moment. And so yeah, I'm very excited for where things can head from there. And it's a lot of responsibility in the role that I'm currently doing, but loving every moment of it.
I can tell. And I think you guys sit nicely in the realm that Andrew Dowling has coined as petite pharma. Not big pharma, petite pharma. So very, very nice. I want to tap into your legal brain here and really tap into your expertise. How would you describe the current legal framework surrounding medicinal cannabis in Australia? Some criticize it, while many think it's one of the best in the world. What are your thoughts on specifically the legal framework around MC in Australia?
Yeah, well, I think I agree with the others. I think it is probably the best medical framework in the world that I've seen, which is funny because it's actually not saying much. Most of the other frameworks around the world from a medical perspective, are pretty poor, and obviously ours has some serious issues as well. But I think you have to kind of view those issues in the context of how long we've been operating. It's been roughly 7 or 8 years since it started. Realistically, it wasn't until COVID that the industry actually took off in earnest, and some large numbers of patients were getting prescribed cannabis, and that's obviously when a lot more regulatory scrutiny, especially within the media, has started to appear. And so I think where we're sitting, we should all be very proud of, and we should be proud of our colleagues who are at the TGA, the ODC, and state health bodies for what they've achieved in a very small period of time. But as all the critics know, and I'm sure you've discussed all of these areas which need improvement, it's a work in progress. And I'm excited to work with the TGA and, potentially whatever other bodies are created. I know there's suggestions that a dedicated cannabis body might be better served to handle it, which I probably agree with. And then obviously significant issues around advertising hasn't been tested. A lot of issues about, GMP and quality of releases. Some of the laws don't work perfectly. Another obviously big one is the vape batteries. That's a big hole that they need to deal with. And I think there was a good couple talks at UIC covering that. But I think overall we're in a great space. The market is growing at something like a 30% compound annual growth rate, which is unheard of in any other market really. And then we've got a regulator that's facilitating access to patients, not without hiccups, not without large hiccups, but I couldn't imagine really any other regulator being able to do it better in such a short period of time. So yeah, I'm kind of quite excited by it all.
I think it's nice to give credit where credit's due. I think there's a lot of criticism of the TGA and the ODC and what they're not doing. But this, circling back to what we've already spoken about, being uncharted territory, makes it really difficult. And there does need to be some conservatism to the approach. What are some of the biggest legal challenges that cannabis companies in Australia face in maintaining compliance with the TGA? We've seen some of the big dogs really push the boundaries. We are waiting for the outcome on some legal cases to kind of set a precedent and help us all understand a little bit more what is allowed and what's not. What are some of these challenges that we're facing that, could be alleviated to make everyone's lives a little bit easier?
Yeah, so advertising is the big one. Obviously, TGA's issued some guidance and they've taken a very broad interpretation of what is considered promoting cannabis. That's the key word. It has to have some sort of an intention, an objectively considered intention, but there has to be something in there which is, intending to promote it. And they've cast a very wide net on that. But until a case goes through the court system, that's the current state of the law. And so I don't think there's much that can be done except hope that Montu doesn't settle, which is, there's a chance that that happens. I'm very much hoping it goes to trial so we can get some guidance. But I think it's just a, wait and see on the advertising front. Other big issues being faced, I think there's one which I've heard very little discussion about, and that's in the tolerance percentages for cannabinoids and how they comply with TGO 93. So for flower, there's a 20% variance. So if you have your label claim at 25%, you're able to have the actual COA on release to be within 20% either way. And with other dose forms like capsules, it's 10%. And that works great, and it allows for variance because it's a natural botanical product. There is variance batch on batch that's released. But what about with minor cannabinoids? What about when you've got, say, CBC in a flower that comes out at 3%? Well, technically, that's an active cannabinoid there. It's above 2%, which means it has to fall into that 20% either side rule. And when you've got 3%, 20% either side is a very, very small amount. And so, how can you possibly meet that requirement batch on batch when we know cannabis plants, they vary at least 1, 2, 3%, pretty consistently, even depending on which testing lab you use, you get different results. So, I think at the moment, most people are kind of just ignoring if they get a 3% minor cannabinoid and just saying, look, let's just not worry about that, which isn't right, doesn't align to the regs. And the risk is that if the TGA start auditing product, actually doing testing to make sure that it's within its label claim, which they may do. I don't think they've done much of that yet, but it's within their power to do. I'm not sure they have the resources either.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, before that happens, I think that's another area that needs to be looked at, and needs to be some sort of an adjustment of the way that 20% is calculated, because I see that as quite a major issue.
I'm really glad you raised that. That was first brought to my attention at UIC, and it's something that's been on my mind quite a bit. And it kind of wraps around to that idea that perhaps there does need to be a dedicated agency that is entirely invested in understanding cannabis and how that works. If that were to be, if we were to wave a magic wand and get this dedicated agency, I know in the Greens legalization bill, they've pitched a aptly named CANA, the Cannabis Australia National Agency. If we were to wave a magic wand and get this agency, what kind of powers would you give them, and what kind of things would you hope to see?
I think the Greens proposal was pretty reasonable. I know obviously the Cannabis Party has different views on how they'd like to see legalization. In my mind, I feel like either proposals I'm happy with. It's all a step forward. But I would do it similar to the Greens do in how they establish the agency. The powers need to be pretty significant, and they need to mirror what the TGA, the current remit. But then there's also areas of the TGA that isn't part of their remit, and that's often, some of the responses you get is, "What are you doing about that?" And they say, "Well, that's actually not our area to enforce." One of the examples there is auditing imports to make sure they're GMP compliant. Well, I think the TGA doesn't have the remit or the resources to do it, but I think whichever new agency is created, if that actually occurred, should have powers to do that. I think really the key is funding. It needs to be adequately funded so that they can enforce the rules they have. Another difficult aspect to advising your clients on advertising right now is that the rules are very broad, but then we've all seen it. There's at least 50 to 60% of the players in the industry that are breaking the laws in some way. It would be great if the TGA had more resources so that they could enforce this. I mean, they just released their report, which showed that they issued something like $1 million worth of fines over 2023, 2024, which sounds like a lot, but it's probably really a drop in the water compared to the bad behavior going on out there.
And I understand it's less than previous years as well, right?
Yeah, correct. I think more infringements, but less fines. But
Yeah.
I'm thinking it's about equivalent to what they did last year, which is great work. But when you're advising your client that it's best just to be squeaky clean, because you should either be squeaky clean, or the other model you could follow is breaking all the rules, and somewhere in the middle is kind of a bad place to be, because you'll get in trouble with regulators. You won't get any of the benefit of the risks that you're facing. So let's be squeaky clean. That's the best approach. But then, of course, clients point out where they say, well, look at all these other people in the industry breaking the laws. Look at
Yeah.
all of them getting an advantage. Are we falling behind on that? So I would very much hope that whatever new agency is created has enough funding so that they could really rigorously enforce the rules, the guidance that they're putting out there, which once again will make it clearer for the people that are trying to do the right thing to say, look, we're doing the right thing, but we're not really facing a massive commercial loss, as a result of doing that. So funding's the key to me.
This is a new thought for me today, so forgive me for being half baked, but I've been wondering, I've been very scathing of the businesses willing to break the law. And then I remember that this whole culture is built on breaking the law and bending the rules. You know, people believe in cannabis and have used it for years despite its legal standing. People have, fought for cannabis and sacrificed for cannabis. I don't know if it's the same kind of anarchist punk rock response in the business world, because I think some people are looking to make money and it's not necessarily an innocent thing. But do you think it's kind of just comes with the territory in cannabis that people want to keep pushing the boundaries? Like, just because we've got legal medicinal cannabis doesn't mean we're where we want to be. So is there kind of a natural proclivity to break the rules? Or do you think it's more just douchey business bros going, no, we want to carve out a bigger part of the market?
For sure, there's a few douchey business bros around, so that part definitely true. But I think the vast majority of the industry, no, not at all. I mean, most of us didn't come from the legacy market. I mean, me as an example, I came from a corporate world. I'm a lawyer. I very much, my inclination is not to break any laws, and I'm very, very risk averse in the way that I advise clients. So I'd hate to think that there's some sort of a legacy impact, which means that, we're just not as good corporate citizens or we don't respect the rule of law. I don't think that's the case. Another way to look at it is in terms of the TGA guidance. Well, that isn't law per se. That's their interpretation of law. The only piece of law is, the definition of what advertising, any statement or picture that has the intention to promote the use of cannabis. That's the law. This is how they're interpreting it. It hasn't gone to court yet. When the court decides it, then they will make more law. They will say, here's the actual answer to what is considered advertising. So the companies that are operating somewhere in the middle, I don't think it's the best strategy. I advise the opposite, to be squeaky clean. But then again, for them to be proven wrong, it kind of needs to go to court. Someone in the middle, some certain actions, it may be once this goes to court, that they're actually found that they haven't breached the law. They're just not complying with the TGA's interpretation of the law, which carries risks itself. So that's why, I wouldn't be critical to say that these other companies are doing something terrible and breaking the law. Some of them clearly are.
Yeah.
Some of them push the envelope so far that that no court would find that what they were doing didn't constitute advertising.
Yeah.
But a lot of them in the middle, there's a genuine question to be determined on what the right interpretation is. And if they're willing to adopt their position, they've thought through it, they thought we're actually fine, they're willing to face the risk that the TGA may issue them an infringement. If they, stick to their guns, they could take that to court and defend it and then have the court decide what the actual real answer is to this question. So in that sense, I don't think they're out to break the law, most of them anyway. I'd hope to think that their intentions, it's good faith intentions behind it. They just think the TGA is wrong and they're willing to wear a bit of risk to get the outcome. But once again, that's not how I advise my clients. I believe the approach until the cases come out, the best approach, the most risk averse and responsible approach, thinking about, the whole industry. We don't want headlines. We don't want to be causing reputational damage to the industry. My advice is stay squeaky clean.
As a fairly risk averse, anxious person myself, that is great life advice that I couldn't agree more. I almost feel like a lot of my listener base are patients, but there are also people in the business world listening to this. I feel like this could almost be a billable hour with the answers you're giving. So I appreciate the thoroughness. Forget the magic wand. Looking at what we do have and what we've got coming in the next kind of 5 to 10 years, what are you anticipating to see in terms of changes in the regulatory framework? Less wishful thinking and more just realistic thinking.
Well, wishful thinking, legalization. So a rec market being developed. I'm not sure if it's wishful or it's realistic. I mean, I've had lots of chats with, our colleagues at the Cannabis Party who are working on this, and you hear about timelines that maybe 5 years would be something, a realistic timeline to see some meaningful change. Don't know what that looks like, and then other changes to see. Hopefully, the driving laws are resolved very quickly because that's just a no-brainer in my mind. And there's so much harm being done by the current framework. So I'm hoping that gets resolved very quickly. Tasmania's already done it. Victoria's made solid steps along the pathway. I believe similar motions are going to be introduced in WA. So from the long-term perspective, I think that's the main areas that'll change. Hopefully a rec market, whatever that looks like, driving changes a little earlier than that. If we're purely going to confine it to the medical market, I think we're at a bit of a crossroads. So patient access has expanded exponentially since 2020, really, when telehealth took off following the COVID epidemic. And since then, the scheme is, the regulators have made it much easier to prescribe cannabis. They've made a lot of moves that have made, really facilitated access. Now we're getting a lot of pushback in the media. Some of the medical bodies are issuing letters, expressing their concerns based on some evidence which no one seems to have seen. And there was actually a great question by Teresa Nicoletti at the conference, which just asked about, what evidence has the TGA seen? And in my interpretation, the veiled response was not much,
Yeah.
but we were always on the lookout. We can't really tell you much. So I think if the narrative in the media is shaped too negatively, we could see some moves brought in which may have an effect in restricting access, and that's exactly the opposite what we need right now. There's the key focus areas. They're looking at the vertical models and the conflict of interest, whether you can properly discharge that conflict, which at the moment you can with if you operate responsibly. And then the other issues about, suggesting patients going to pharmacies, they're looking at that, the different ways you can legally do that versus illegally, doing something like that. And then other limits which we've seen overseas, so limits on the strength of cannabis. Germany, there's limits on how the strength that you can prescribe. There's other jurisdictions. I don't think it's likely to happen soon, but I think that is an area that they may visit. If the media narrative turns against the industry, that especially the concerns about increasing the likelihood of psychosis, which once again, I don't think there's much evidence that I've seen. But if that narrative goes the wrong way and there's more inappropriate prescribing and more articles that come out of people ending up in psychosis, well, then the logical step they'll take is they say, well, what can we do here? We can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. There's, almost 1 million patients out there who've received product at some point during so far, but they may look at doing, well, why don't we limit the THC per day? I mean, already there's limits on the amount per day, whether depending on the state, you have to get certain approvals if it's over, say, 300 milligrams in WA, and the other states have limits, some of them 500. I could see some more action in that space, but it depends. If we can turn the narrative into the positive outcomes and all of the positive stories. We have a clinic. We see these day to day. I see cancer patients that come in, and it's literally inspiring what we're doing. And I think if we continue to be able to shape that narrative to show all the positives and benefits, then I don't see any reason for the government to restrict access. Things will keep growing. We'll slowly but surely take over the market share that medical patients in the black market, and then onwards and upwards and from there until 5-10 years, whenever that happens, and the big shift changes when we get a recreational market. So yeah, that's what I think we can expect.
How do you stay ahead or even just abreast of legal shifts and potential risks that could impact, MediCann's operations or just the cannabis market in general? Like, you are treading uncharted territory, but how do you ensure you stay in the loop?
Yep. So there's a few resources around. There's obviously a lot of guidance that's regularly put out by the various regulators. There's also the Medical Cannabis Expert Working Group that it's the TGA and the ODC together. They've got some experts, and they kind of don't publish a lot of detail, but they give you some bullet points on the issues that they're thinking about, and that might be a bit of a forecast into if there's particular issues raised, you might see some change down the track 6 months, a year later. The other one is obviously cannabis is actually a great resource. You've got to stay on top of cannabis. They give you all the articles from what's happening in the industry. Other things. I've got cannabis Google alerts set up. I follow podcasts. Podcasts are great. So I listen to a lot of the international podcasts which talk about the developments happening in Canada and the US, other markets too. And that can kind of be a bit of a crystal ball to, especially some of the economic developments that you see, the bubble for how the market slowly expands, reach a bit of a bubble point, then prices compress over a number of years, they stabilize, and then big regulatory catalysts shake things up. And then the other aspect is probably your network. So having regular chats with the other compliance experts in cannabis around Australia, which we do. It's a great collaborative industry. And, honestly, there's probably only about five good cannabis lawyers around Australia who really understand the scheme. So we kind of have to stick together a little bit and share findings. So yeah, there's a few different resources, but it's not new cases coming out. We all follow the couple cases and check the federal court portal to see, when each step in the proceedings, if there's new orders coming out. You don't get much off that, but yeah, you have to have a broad selection of different resources to stay on top of it all.
Is there a market around the world that you look at that is just, I don't know, fascinating to you? Either gives you an example of how not to do things, it just excites you. Like, I look at Thailand, I just think it's incredibly fascinating the way it was just a bit of a like, all right, guys, go for it. And then trying
Yeah.
to pull it back a little bit, trying to find the equilibrium. It does seem the horse is bolted, so it's not going to we're not going to lose too much. Like, I'm off there in a couple of months to have a fantastic tourism experience. Is there somewhere around the world that excites or fascinates you?
So exciting, probably Germany. With where they're at and the size of the market, they're behind us. So they've had a medical system for a while, but then the most recent changes, which moves towards a recreational market, but isn't actually there yet. There's a few steps they need to follow before they actually establish a proper market. But what it did do is expand access for their medical system. So the indications that you could prescribe cannabis for were very restricted before. Now they're very broad. And so they're just kind of taking off. They feel like what Australia was like in about 2020, where they're taking off in their medical system, but the market is massive.
That's kind of fascinating that like the legalization of some kind of recreational model has actually enhanced medicinal cannabis in a way, because oftentimes you see the opposite, kind of they throw the baby out with the bathwater. But that's really cool that it's improved it.
It has. It's backwards, as you
Yeah.
said. They're doing it slightly differently to us, in ways that you release the product and, that have different quality requirements to ours. Ours are very strict. Theirs are also strict, but in a different way. So that's probably the most exciting market, but can't really learn too much from it. It's still in its infancy, although it'll be a big one. But, the jurisdictions to look at for lessons is Canada and the US. US, very different model. It's state by state. It's also a hyper capitalist model, which I think most people in Australia don't want to see. It's a little out of control there. I mean, I'm an economist. I do the dream. I love free market economics, but with cannabis, there has to be some really significant controls, even in a recreational market, about advertising, and even I even support some of the Greens' proposals to restrict certain players from the industry where it's not really appropriate. The alcohol, tobacco industry are the ones. I'm not sure it's fair, but I can see some benefit to that.
Yeah.
The Canadian model is interesting. It's federally legal, but once again, there's very little restrictions. They have centralized distribution in a lot of the states, which is a pretty different as well. I mean, we have distributors all around the country. They're cannabis specific distributors. There's also the general medicine distributors, a few of them, your Sigmas, your APIs, your ones that service Chemist Warehouse. And I think there's a little bit of involvement with the larger players. So, that's a big difference to the market, is that we have a lot of different competitive aspects to the distributor model. I don't think anyone's done it exactly right. So there's lessons learned from those jurisdictions. We need to do our own thing to some degree. And then there's the excitement from the German system. And then I suppose Portugal, they've been running a pretty interesting model for quite a few years in the kind of decriminalized model. It's not just cannabis, it's harder drugs as well. So I reckon there's some lessons to be learned from that jurisdiction. I don't think we should have exactly the same model, but a harm-based approach to drugs, that's definitely the way to go. I know
Yeah.
that's what's the Cannabis Party, the Greens are advocating. Everyone's on board that we definitely should treat this as a health issue. So yeah, lessons to be gained from all around the world, and excitement to be gained from a couple specific ones.
Right on, right on. I think the point you made about the US is really important. Like, you can philosophically be fascinated by what they've got going on there, but I really do believe that until it's federally legal there, it's not really a case study on how to operate, because it's just a patchwork of really challenging different regulations in about 30 odd states that are allowing it and 20 odd that are
Yeah.
not. So yeah,
And dealing with just cash, that's crazy.
isn't it?
The fact that they can't use banking services, and it's been so hard to get the Safe Banking Act,
Yeah.
in some form before the committees, that's crazy to me. That's something that
There's a fear amongst the populace as well, because I used to work as a bud tender in Canada, and Americans would come across the border, want to buy cannabis, but would refuse to use their plastic. They're just like, nah, I've got to pay cash. I do not want this tracked. Like, there's some real fear and worry there. So, or as good a job as America has done at normalizing cannabis, there's still a lot of kind of fear and stigma and trepidation that people need to navigate. So yeah, until it's federally legal, it's a bit of an ugly system.
yeah.
Now, we're going to take a little break from the serious stuff for a moment to have a bit of fun with a quiz. You share with me that you're quite the Simpsons fans, an essential part of any reasonable childhood. And on today's quiz, we're going to go into a topic that couldn't be more fitting. We're going to talk about Springfield's resident lawyer, Lionel Theodore Hutz. Now, there are 7 multiple choice questions here. Do you have any questions of your own before we start this quiz?
No, definitely one of my favorite characters. Probably my favorite fictional lawyer of all time. So yeah, I'm ready. Let's launch into it.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm hoping he's not an inspiration of yours, but definitely probably one of the first exposures to the legal profession for you as a kid.
Yeah, lessons learned. Another one of them.
All right, so we've got 7 questions here, all multiple choice. Chime in whenever you're ready. Question 1. In which episode does Lionel Hutz first appear? Is it Bart Gets an F in Season 2, The Telltale Head in Season 1, or Simpson and Delilah in Season 2?
Simpson and Delilah.
That is correct. So in that episode, Homer gets a hair transplant and ends up needing legal help, leading to the introduction of Lionel Hutz. So his first appearance.
Yeah, great one.
On the board. 1 from 1. All right, question 2. What is one of Lionel Hutz's most famous catchphrases? Is it, I rest my case, I'm not a licensed lawyer, but I play one on TV, or you can't handle the truth?
I rest my case.
Denied.
Denied. It is, I'm not a licensed lawyer, but I play one on TV. Now, he does, of course, say, I rest my case, but it's not a famous catchphrase. So there is
all right, fair enough. Partial credit.
Well, you've split it. You're at 50% so far. Let's see how you go on question 3. In Marge in Chains in Season 6, Lionel Hutz represents Marge when she's accused of shoplifting. What does he mistakenly refer to as evidence? A broken lamp, B, a bottle of cough syrup, or C, a loaf of bread?
Bottle of cough syrup.
That is correct. Indeed. One of the many times he shows his incompetence, he doesn't even have the right evidence with him. I'm sure that's the kind of thing that would get someone disbarred, right?
Oh, you'd have some questions raised.
All right, 2 from 3. Question 4. Which of these is not a profession Lionel Hutz claims to have had in the show? So which of these is not?
Not.
A private detective, B, a used car salesman, or C, mortician?
Mortician.
That is correct.
That is correct. He does claim throughout the show that he's been a private detective and a used car salesman. A couple of more incompetent jobs for him there, but you are indeed correct. He's never claimed to be a mortician. Question 5. In the episode in Season 6, The Springfield Connection, Lionel Hutz is hired by which Simpson family member to defend them in court? Is it Homer, Lisa, or Marge?
Homer.
Denied.
Denied. So, in this episode, The Springfield Connection, Lionel Hutz is hired by Marge to represent her in a case where she is accused of organizing a neighborhood vigilante group. So...
yes.
Look, still over 50%. That's what counts. Question 6. In Who Shot Mr. Burns Part 1, Lionel Hutz takes over the case for which character? Apu, Mr. Burns, or Smithers?
Takes over the case.
Yeah, so they've got an existing lawyer. they get fired or an existing legal team gets fired and Lionel Hutz is hired in their place?
Smithers.
Denied. I was hoping that hint would help you. There was a legal team. Who could afford a legal team in Springfield?
It would have to be Mr. Burns then. Yeah, you're right. Your legal team.
Look, I went deep for this one. When you said The Simpsons, I'm like, oh, this could be so easy.
These ones are tricky, I tell you.
Look, we like to learn something through the quiz, so I like to think even if we're getting them wrong, we're getting an education.
Yeah.
Now, this one is going to test how well you were listening to my introduction, because our final question is, what is Lionel Hutz's full name? Is it Lionel Theodore Hutz, Lionel Charles Hutz, or Lionel James Hutz?
Theodore.
That is correct.
In the episode A Star is Burns, we have the reveal that his full name is Lionel Theodore Hutz. Well, you didn't nail that one there, mate. You showed higher competency than Lionel Hutz, but you did well with, 4 out of 7 there? That's over 50%. Well done.
That's a pass.
I had Reese Cohen on the show last week, and he absolutely nailed his quiz. And he's just like, "Is there like a leaderboard or something I can be on the top of?" I appreciate you playing there. Fantastic part of any childhood. Whenever I hear a parent talk about how they don't let their kids watch The Simpsons, I'm like, God, they're missing out.
Yeah, what an important piece of education that we had growing up in the 90s and early 2000s.
Exactly, and those were the glory years as well. I didn't allow any questions. I didn't do any research on questions beyond season 13 there, because that just doesn't exist to me.
Yep, good call.
All right, as we head towards the tail end of the show, our second topic I want to cover, to some extent, is cannabis on the stock exchange. This is something that kind of we've seen around the world. I personally was accused of taking Aurora stocks when I was a bud tender in Canada. I'd have baby boomers coming in and asking me why their $80,000 investment was now at zero. You've got experience working on the Australian Stock Exchange. What would you consider to be the benefits of listing a company publicly?
Well, the main reason you would do it is access to capital. So it facilitates the ability to raise capital in a much easier way. So private companies, they need to find investors. They have often started with friends and family, and then there's VCs and private equity firms. They go through capital raisings, but it's very much a process where you need to kind of have the right brokers, people involved, the right connections to raise money. It's much more difficult. The benefit of being listed on the exchange is that you can raise money from public markets. You can get the tin can, you can rattle it around for shareholders and raise money. The negative to that is that there's much more stringent financial disclosure requirements, much more stringent corporate governance requirements. But that's the main reason you list. You list so you can raise money. I guess there's another aspect to it. You might list as an exit strategy for a private company as well. So if you're a private company, you want to at some point sell your shares and make your money back and exit the industry. And you could do it via a private sale, but you could also float it on the exchange, and then you could sell your shares as part of a public sale. There's rules around that. There's actually, you might be locked up in escrow, what we would say, for a couple of years. You can't just list it and then flick the shares off straight away. There are rules to protect against that. But it's a way that you can exit from the industry and realize a return on your investment.
I know that you spoke in some detail on the AltMed podcast about the ways that some companies kind of flout the advertising rules by using public disclosures. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Like, how does that work, and what determines whether something is, an allowable disclosure or not?
So it's tricky. The obligation to the exchange is to disclose all matters that are material. So it's matters that your average investor would expect to increase or decrease the price of securities. And so what that entails is certain updates that companies may provide on new products, pricing, deals, contracts, that sort of thing. Well, the rules say you have to disclose anything that's material, but the rules on the stock exchange also say the market announcements platform is not a place to advertise. We do not allow you to facilitate advertising. So it's a little bit of a balancing act the stock exchange will play, where they will assess an announcement that's released by a company. They'll say, well, okay, what are the material matters? There's a lot of guidance. It's very well established, lots of cases. There's lawyers on both sides that, study what this word means. and they go through and they say, well, what's material here? And if they can't find anything in this announcement which they consider to be material, they would say, well, what's the reason they lodged it? Well, it's promotional. It's to, you know, ramp the price of their securities. It's basically advertising, which is prohibited. The thing is, though, is that it's the ASX that administer the stock exchange rules, whereas it's the TGA that administer the general advertising rules around Australia. And they administer it differently. The TGA takes a very, very wide interpretation of what's advertising, and they'll ping you for anything. If you mention your brand name in public, that's advertising, according to the TGA. That's the current state of the law. Whereas on the stock market, we would be looking for things that are a bit more clearly defined as promoting, that have no real material value. And sometimes it's in the middle. Sometimes material matters could also be considered advertising. But the way the ASX works is their rules take precedence over basically any other rule that applies. So if it's a material matter, even if the TGA thought it was advertising, the ASX would say, well, no, they have to disclose it, and we have no problem with that, and the TGA are not going to take any action. The borderline cases, though, where there's a material matter they've disclosed, we've signed a new contract worth so many millions of dollars, which is we consider material, and then by the way, we've got some new product lines, and here's our new strain, and it's a super tasty, flavorsome strain. You should buy it. Which happens. You get something like that tacked onto the bottom of an announcement, and that becomes tricky because the ASX's policy is, well, we're just concerned with our rules. We're not worried about the TGA rules. The TGA administer their own rules. We're satisfied that it's material. The extra wording they put at the bottom, if it's over the line, then the ASX will give them a call and say, hey, this isn't okay. This is advertising. We'll either delete it pre-release if it's reviewed pre-release, or if it's already gone out there, it'll say, don't do this again. Otherwise, you'll get a line of queries, which we consider ramping. So why did you make this? We consider it's promotional. If you keep doing this, this may lead to a referral to ASIC, and then ASIC could prosecute you. But it's basically two different teams of lawyers, the TGA lawyers and the ASX lawyers, looking at it from two different angles. And so it makes sense from a regulatory perspective, but the punter on the street, they're looking at announcements and they're saying, look at this is advertising. We're told we can't do this. Look what they're doing on the stock exchange. And well, the ASX can only do what the ASX can do, and the TGA can only do what they can do. And sometimes I think it's fair to say that things fall into the cracks in the middle occasionally.
I so appreciate this conversation today because I think you have brought a lot of fantastic perspective to a topic that is not an area of my expertise. Despite my love for cannabis, the legal side of things, you can't know everything. And so I often go, I'll leave the legal stuff to the boffins and, I'll keep talking about the culture and things like that. But you've really opened my eyes and shared a lot of fantastic things today that have really made me think. And I think it's evidence of how much is going on behind the scenes. Patients get their tub and, it might be X amount of dollars for X amount of grams, but there is so much going on behind the scenes to make sure that got to them and make sure that works. So I appreciate everything that you've shared today. Our final kind of point that I want to talk about is that we're seeing this shift towards crowdfunding. We're seeing a lot of cannabis companies using a crowdfunding model instead of going the traditional IPO route. What do you see as the kind of pros and cons for medicinal cannabis companies turning to crowdfunding as a funding source?
Yeah. So the main benefit is it's much cheaper to do. An IPO, it might cost you $500,000 in just advisor fees to actually get it processed. And then you'll pay a fee to the stock exchange. Once again, it could be hundreds of thousands of dollars just as a listing fee. So it's much more expensive. It's more about the stage of development. So if you're an early stage company, which doesn't have a need for, millions and millions of bucks regularly, there's limits on how much you can crowdfund. I think it's $3 million you can do through a crowdfund. And then I think it's over a certain amount, then you got to do audited statements, which adds to the cost. So if you only need to raise $1 million, it's very cheap, easy to do. The disclosure requirements are much less stringent. It also means from the other side, the risk to shareholders are actually a little higher because they don't get the same level of disclosure from investing in public companies. But then also public companies are subject to market sentiment. So we'd all see stock prices in cannabis. They're very depressed at the moment. The valuations if you look at the valuations per share price, there's various metrics you use, but they're very, very cheap companies at the moment because the sentiment in cannabis in public markets is very low. There was the huge bubble in 2020. All these companies that said they were going to make millions of bucks instantly didn't, and so expectations dropped very, very quickly, and we're kind of you're subject to public market expectations. Schedule 3 change, down scheduling in the US may have a large impact. Crystal ball stuff, don't know. But catalysts like that might have a large impact on your share price and your valuation in the public market in Australia. Whereas if you're a private company that has just obtained capital through crowdfunding initially or other private equity funding rounds, then your share price doesn't really change. I mean, it's really the share price is what someone's willing to pay for it, but you do a valuation, you get people to do a valuation, and at the time you do the crowdfunding, and that's kind of set. There's a lot less volatility built in there. But you'll reach a point in your development where you won't be able to raise enough through crowdfunding, and then say the appetite might dry up in crowdfunding. You're going after basically small ma and pa investors who are mostly going to throw in $500 because they support the industry. They're often patients. They're often people who are not as much focused on the financial metrics. They're more focused on the journey and the story behind it and the fact that they support the industry. So it's really a question of what stage of development are you? How much money do you need to raise? And what are you raising off? Are you raising off the story behind your company and where you can go in the future? Or do you want to go after more sophisticated investors who are going to have a closer look at the financial metrics, the multiples, the long-term trends, the market sentiment, international trends? It's a different class of investor. So yeah, that's the way I view it.
Do you think, given the kind of volatility in the market and that public perception, that we will see companies kind of continue to kind of tiptoe towards the ASX, or do you think we'll see more companies try the crowdfunding thing here? Kind of what's the sentiment around being publicly listed right now?
Well, it hasn't worked great for any of the publicly listed cannabis companies to date. And I think there's reasons for that. So if you look at the cannabis companies, the vast majority, the listed ones, the vast majority are either cultivators or research companies. And both those industries require a huge amount of capital to get off the ground. And that's probably why they went for a public listing. If you look at the publics, they've raised, they may do 4 capital raises for $2 million over a year. And then they might have raised 30, 40 million bucks already on the exchange. And they need that to build cultivation facilities, to conduct very expensive clinical trials that may or may not come up with a positive outcome. And so they haven't done very well. And I think it's because they're in a very difficult area of the market. The privates have generally been the clinics and the sponsors, which has turned out to be, I think, a much better area of the industry to operate. It's been the more profitable companies are in that space. The wholesalers as well are earning pretty good money, but they don't need a huge amount of money to operate, and so they've most of them stuck to the private route. The other aspect is, as I said, you're at the whims of the market. I think institutional capital for the public listed companies, there's very little of that. They're scared off the space because they're scared out of the US markets because it's not federally legal. And so down scheduling, and then what we would say an uplisting, so the US markets being able to list on the NASDAQ rather than just being on the TSX, they're on a bigger exchange, which facilitates more institutional capital, which theoretically should flow down to other international markets. And so, it's been very tricky. Doesn't mean that there's not huge potential in a number of the listed companies out there. I mean, we work very closely with some of them, and they're great leaders. They've set up fantastic businesses. It may just be that it's a longer timeline, particularly the cultivators, to reach that profitable position, and then from there, once you get profitable, to get those share prices up. So yeah, it's a tricky space to be in at the moment in the listed markets.
Our final segment is called Polls of Wisdom, and though we value the long-form conversation, we try to leave the listener with one key takeaway, dinner party fact, or even a call to action. So Sean, what is your poll of wisdom for the listener?
Yeah, well, it's a call to action, I think, in this case, and we touched on it before. The incentive at the moment for certain players in the industry to get down into the weeds and start breaking the advertising laws and also, the prescribing laws. As I said before, we're at a turning point. we really need to make sure the media narrative focuses on the positives coming out of the industry. So I would urge other players to not get tempted to do a bit of advertising, under the reasoning that others are doing it, therefore I should. I think if we all can do our very best to be responsible custodians of this industry, which we're lucky to have. This is only made 8-9 years ago, and honestly, if you told me that I could be a cannabis lawyer 8-9 years ago, I wouldn't have believed you. So we have this amazing opportunity. The major risk to it, though, is irresponsible prescribing, media headlines resulting, and then governments being forced to take regulatory action. So my call to action is don't get dragged down into the weeds. Try and continue to do your very best to comply with all the laws and keep regulators happy and keep the industry moving forward on its current path.
I absolutely love it. Sean says, stay squeaky clean. It's the 5 S's. It's an amazing call to action to leave people with. Sean, I said it before, I'll say it again. This could have been a billable hour. It's been an absolute delight to talk to you with all the insights you shared today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks very much, Paul. I really enjoyed it.